Well, hello everyone. Bonjour. Very excited to be here. So this panel is on growing nuclear capacity to power tomorrow, and we'll just get started right away so we can get through everything. So I did want to give a little context to start for those of you not as familiar with nuclear. So it might seem a little bit out of place for us to be talking about nuclear energy at an event called Hello Tomorrow, because nuclear often feels like a technology of the past, a sort of Cold War relic, something that's being shut down, phased out in a lot of countries. And 10 years ago, most of us might have thought, this has no place in sort of wealthy countries and climate programs. But if you haven't been following, things have been changing quite fast in the last 10 years, even the last 5 years. There are 100 companies across North America and Europe that are developing advanced nuclear technologies. Many of them are startups with venture funding, and they're developing new and innovative technologies. And what's driving this trend reversal is two things. One's a really old trend, a really old driver, which is energy security, and the other one is climate change, of course, and the need for carbon-free energy. So I know everyone here in Europe understands the energy crisis that really began with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the need to diversify away from imports of Russian energy. But if you're not as familiar perhaps with how this affected nuclear, several countries changed their long-standing policies on nuclear energy in response to the gas crisis. So countries that had planned phase-outs or shutdowns of nuclear plants extended them, or even are talking about new builds now. Even Ukraine is looking at new nuclear energy build-out. And on the other side of the world, Japan, because of increasing gas prices, has also been looking to accelerate restarts of their reactors that were closed temporarily after Fukushima. In the US, where I'm from, perhaps you can tell, there's been really strong bipartisan support in our Congress for at least 10 years around nuclear energy. But two and a half years ago, our government passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a whole suite of investments and incentives for nuclear that's really pushing a lot of interest in the technology. A lot of utilities are starting to pursue it, and it's spurred a lot of more private investment in these companies that are developing the technology. In culmination of all of this, at COP28, which was 2 years ago now, we saw at the time 22 countries make a pledge to triple global nuclear capacity by 2050. I think it's now 30 countries. And we just saw an announcement a couple days ago that Google, Meta, Amazon, and what's the fourth one? Not Microsoft. What Meta is that? Amazon, Google, Meta, are joining that pledge to triple global nuclear capacity. So there's a lot of interest, a lot of resurgence, and it really comes down to new technologies, new companies, and new business models. So I'm very excited about the panelists that we have here today that were already introduced, so we'll skip their names and titles, but I do have kind of starter questions for each of them to introduce a little bit more of their work. And then I'm hoping we'll have lots of time for audience questions and discussion, because I know nuclear energy, people have lots of questions. So to kick it off, for Kirsty, in the last decade, as I've said, we've seen this big paradigm shift in thinking about nuclear as climate tech, as part of the suite of solutions. So how has your work at Terra Praxis advanced that policy set, particularly in Europe and maybe elsewhere?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. So Terra Praxis is a non-profit organization, and for those of you that don't know, Terra obviously means Earth, which we're sort of standing on here. Praxis means putting theory into action, so we're sort of like action for Earth. And in Europe, a big piece of our focus has been on advocating for nuclear energy to support our energy security, affordability, reliability goals, not just for power generation, but also looking at a whole range of energy services that could be provided with nuclear energy, because the beauty about nuclear is that, firstly, of course, it has a tiny environmental footprint, much like this stage. But it also, in addition to being very dense and always on, so very reliable or high capacity factor, it doesn't just produce power, but it also, of course, makes heat. And so the opportunity to co-locate small modular reactors, like the kind that you'll hear from Stefano and his company in a moment, you could co-locate these small modular reactors with existing industrial facilities to switch out the fossil fuels that are currently being burned to make heat or power or steam at coal plants, refineries, steel plants, chemical plants, as well as, indeed, for the production of electricity for the grid, but actually to directly supply heat and power for those industrial applications in a way that matches the existing site footprint and ideally matches the cost and the performance of the fossil fuels that you're replacing. So we've been sort of advocating for nuclear energy for those kinds of applications. And just to give you an idea, 3 of the things that we've been involved in Europe include getting nuclear included in the sustainable finance taxonomy, very important. Working on, thank you. Working on repowering coal fleets, particularly focusing on Central and Eastern Europe, which are very coal-intensive countries, and developing a new opportunity for AI, which is using AI to generate license applications, which represents one of the really big barriers to getting nuclear energy over the line. And I can talk more about any of those things.
Great, thank you. For Stefano, Newcleo has quite a different business model than kind of a typical nuclear startup that may be just trying to commercialize a reactor design. Can you explain kind of the acquisition strategy?
Yes. So Newcleo is a European company. We are one of the 100 that you were mentioning, but pretty distinctive because we have raised a lot of money for Europe. It's more than 530 million euros. So we actually are using a technology that, in spite of looking innovative, it's coming from the past. So we are just really putting together technologies that have been proven in different contexts. So we use liquid lead that was used by the Russians in the 60s. We developed fast reactor, and we use in the steels and the solution that has been developed in the sodium reactors of France. And we are using a fuel which was developed before I was born, that is MOX, and is made out of nuclear waste. And this is very distinctive for Europe because it opens the way to energy independence. And when I say independence, I say hundreds of years of electricity for free to be able to extract from the nuclear waste that is present already in Europe, and then open the way also to the competitivity of European industry if we manage to do very cheap nuclear, inexpensive nuclear. This is possibly the biggest challenge. So why we are doing acquisitions? Because in the past, I would say almost 40 years, nuclear has been paralyzed. So the industry has continued to support the industry that was existing, and all of the supply chain, all of the people involved into this industry need to move on, to reinvest, to recreate a new supply chain, to hire new people, etc. Since we don't have a technology barriers, is really an industrial venture. We are rebuilding this supply chain, not only interacting with all of the actors in the market, but also trying to go in those companies that really were phasing out themselves from nuclear and try to reinforce them, to relaunch them, and to invest into this company. That's why we have a slightly different approach.
Great, thank you. And for Gaëtan, historically, nuclear energy has been largely publicly funded and with big government involvement, owned and operated by large state-owned or state-supported utilities. How is that changing, and does Breakthrough Energy see nuclear as a profitable investment for private financing?
Oh, first of all, hi everybody. Thanks for coming to such a interesting subject. So it's hard for nuclear, right? So I was in nuclear as an entrepreneur from 2008 until 2016. We're not doing power, we're doing management of waste. But as was alluded to by Stefano, closing the cycle one way or another is very important in nuclear. And that's actually one of the things that nuclear needs to do is, on the fission side, is clean up the way that you do the cycling, right? And there are very few countries where that has been decided, voted into law, unfortunately, which creates in itself an issue for private ventures, or at least for venture capitalists. So, and there I want to make a distinction. Bill Gates, who is often associated because he's one of the main sponsors of Breakthrough Energy Ventures, of which I'm part of, he's an investor, a massive investor in Terra Power, which is a US-based company that has developed a next-generation fission reactor. Breakthrough Energy Ventures has yet to find a mechanism to invest in fission for a number of reasons that I'll touch upon. But we have concluded that it makes sense to do private investment alongside public investment because they're almost always necessary, no question, for fusion. And part of analysis was linked to the grid requirements to be able to go to net zero. And the necessity to do so in a way that had what, in our terminology, but everybody's got their own jargonic term, is what we call the net green premium. And so it's how much more expensive are you to the current industries that are emitting CO2 or greenhouse gases while they're providing power to grids, right? So you'll see we are looking very closely at grid-based or utility-based systems as opposed to local systems, even though they're important, they must exist, but it's not something we've looked at as much as we've looked at grid-based power. And there, even though solar and wind have gone down in price, it's really hard to firm up that electricity, and that can be extremely incrementally expensive to get from a capacity factor of 50 to 60 to 75. Higher than 75 is really hard to do. And even though batteries are there, when you look at firm power, you don't have a lot of options, right? You have geothermal, which is pretty expensive. And we looked at and have invested in geothermal as well. But nuclear is definitely something that we should look at and keep supporting. And so in our case, like I said, fission, we found that it's a established market when a part of the way that we evaluate the ability for ventures to be backable is how new of a space it creates around itself. And as Stefano was saying, there is a little bit of sclerosis around the fission space, and it's been difficult for us to find areas of investment alongside public investments. But on fusion, we have found, and we've made 4 investments to date. And certainly we keep looking at fission. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mind, I'll just quickly jump in because I think that what you're saying is of course I agree with you, but we're also at a very interesting moment. So 2 things I think are happening in addition to the sort of larger political context, Jessica, that you were pointing to, and one of those is that advanced reactor companies are progressing very well through their commercialization journey, and of course Nucleo is here to speak to that. But there are, I think now more than 80 startups in the United States alone that are productizing quite well understood a whole range of different sorts of reactor technologies, different sizes for different applications. So that's one thing that's a sort of an interesting moment for investors that I think is beginning to really attract the attention of the investment community and financial institutions, that these products are coming to market soon. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that we've seen large industrial energy users begin to become much more visible in their demand for nuclear. And I think we'll probably speak to that more during this panel. But I think that combination of market demand and near readiness is a very new kind of dynamic.
Yeah, thank you for that added context. And I'm going to, I want to encourage everyone to submit questions through the app. I've already seen some come through. Thank you. But I wanted to frame kind of our discussion around two halves. So biggest market opportunities and biggest market challenges. We've already touched on a lot of those. But I think the one that I find most interesting and exciting, as I'm going to ask Kirsty first, is coal to nuclear. And you mentioned Eastern Europe, but I think for those of you probably haven't heard that term, coal to nuclear, and thinking about what to do with all these places that still have a lot of coal on their grids.
So obviously there's a lot of coal. There's 2 terawatts operating globally today. It represents 1/3 of our global carbon emissions, which is kind of incredible. So it's the biggest single source of global carbon emissions, obviously not just for grid power, it's used in industry as well. And there are a lot of countries in Europe and everywhere that are still, largely coal-intensive grids. And it's very challenging to, think about ways that we can eliminate those emissions because people need the energy and there's already a kind of grid infrastructure serving those towns and cities. And frankly, people need jobs. They need those jobs. There's socioeconomic benefits associated with those plants. So the prospect of just abandoning those assets is really challenging, even in countries with old coal, like in Europe and in the United States. And obviously then, when you look more globally, about half of the fleet is actually very young and only about, less than 14 years old on average. There's $1 trillion of unrecovered capital in the global coal fleet. So these are the kind of conditions that Terra Praxis started with when we began thinking about this problem. And one of the things we realized is that if we could repower those coal plants with small modular reactors co-located at those existing coal plant sites to create heat and steam, so emissions-free, clean steam, to run through those existing coal plant turbines if they're still in good condition and well-maintained and so on, then you could essentially keep that plant operating, but without emissions. And that's a really powerful idea for those communities, for the workforces, for the countries that depend on that power. And you wouldn't have to build new grid. In the United States, there's 200 gigawatts of coal still operating, but on average less than 50% capacity factor. So imagine if you could repower all those coal plants and maybe double the amount of electricity running into that grid, because you would increase the capacity up to 90% or more, and that's before you upgrade those transmission lines. That's almost doubling the amount of power without emissions, without building any more transmission. So this is a very powerful idea, but not if it takes 10 years and billions of dollars to build one nuclear plant. So what we're really interested in is developing a way that's really fast and low cost and repeatable, leveraging design for manufacture and assembly principles to essentially modernize the delivery of nuclear into something that looks much more like a manufactured product, so that the plants don't change each time, they're site independent, and you could essentially have a kind of product-based licensing model. So that's one of the things we've been working on in Central and Eastern Europe and in other countries, to essentially commodify the delivery of nuclear, to make it look much more like a commodified product that can be delivered by normal project developers, financed through mainstream finance, just like the way that we modernize the delivery of wind and solar.
Wonderful, thank you. I had a question on, nuclear waste came up, and I had a question, want to talk a little bit more about nuclear waste or spent fuel, as it's also referred to more accurately. And I also had a question about diversifying the fuel supply, so I want to combine those. So I think everyone's very familiar that Europe was quite dependent on Russia for methane, for gas. But they're also quite dependent, the nuclear industry is quite dependent on Russia for uranium fuel, and so is the US, or was. And both regions have been trying to diversify, but I guess this question is maybe for Stefano and also Gaëtan. We think of nuclear waste often as a big challenge for nuclear, but there's a lot more people thinking about it as a market opportunity, and particularly for new ways of thinking about the sustainability of the fuel cycle and making it more efficient, more sustainable. So either of you, yeah, waste as an opportunity.
Can I start first? Yes, it's what I was telling at the very beginning. The use of fuel that we have done with the PWR industry has been very poor because we have really burned a very limited amount of energy, extracted a very limited amount of energy. And so if we take a country like France that produced essentially half of the nuclear energy of Europe, France have like 7,000 years of electricity, 100% of their needs ahead of the country if it's reusing this energy effectively. So why it wasn't done in the past? Just because it was too expensive. And the sodium reactors that would have allowed this cycle, closed cycle, they were really more expensive than PWRs, and nuclear was already more expensive than fossil fuels. So we struggled to, already with the competition, the nuclear industry was not able to endorse the cost of a more sustainable cycle. So we had to redesign the industry. We had to go to modular, small. We had to possibly also change the technology in our case and try to simplify those reactors that could burn that waste. I think the industry today is mature to do this, certainly is our company. So we have a great opportunity, I think, to transform what is a liability for most of the operators of nuclear energy, at least in Europe, into an asset. And this is a big challenge that I think Europe is very ready to take, driven by France, actually, who's giving the example. But we are already collaborating with Slovakia on the same subject with the support of France. So something is really happening.
Yeah, I mean, let me take the quick side for and then the longer side against. The quick side for, it's fantastic that so many people, more people are looking at that. And if you look at any other material that we use, and that's what I'm going to get to next in terms of the negative, funny enough, is you'll find that you have a lot more intrinsic value in spent fuel, the way it's being used by the current design of reactors, where upwards of 95% of the potential energy is left in the fuel that it's rotated out of the plants. Whereas if you look at everything else that we use, even single-use plastic, right, it's really, really hard to recreate value with it. And so I think it's really fascinating and encouraging to see more and more people looking at spent fuel as something that is more of a resource than a fuel. And on the last bit of super positive, I would say, because so many countries have yet to close the loop regulatorily, i.e. decide what's plan A for fuel, that opens up the door for regulations to accept those new technologies, which is great. Now, that being said, spent fuel by default will, at least in our estimation at BEV, and I share that also personally as someone who's been in that space, will be heavily regulated. Right now, if you have a plan to do recycling of plastics or recycling of biomass or a biomethane play, there are regulations, but nearly not as heavy as they're going to be or they currently are for fuel. And so that's really a call for public-private partnerships, because otherwise we're going to get stuck into no end. And these are heavily technical subjects, right? Depending on the design of the reactor that you're considering, depending on exactly how the fuel gets transformed to be repowering units, you may or may not end up in endless conversations as to this particular radioactive element gets concentrated or gets generated, like plutonium, for example. What do we do with that piece? And the history on the fission side shows that we need to take that up front. Otherwise, we end up with a non-fully closed system where what happens to some of those elements that are long-lived and potentially dangerous is not decided as we start a cycle. And I think that's been a plague for the nuclear industry, because it's very easy for the detractor to point to all those non-resolved issues. And so having this new potential is fantastic, because it allows us to finish those debates clean it up and have something that's an example for the rest of the industries, right? So I hope we turn that into a positive.
Can I just say that also I think people are beginning to, to think about, like, when we say what about the waste, I think people are increasingly much more worried about the atmospheric carbon pollution caused by burning fossil fuels in terms of, massive implications in terms of public health as well as climate change. And we have to put spent nuclear fuel into the context of other kinds of waste.
It's very small. It is orders of magnitude smaller. And then we can open the whole debate on the way that we decide that something is radioactive or not, which is right now, if it's man-made, it's linear, no threshold, which is even if you detect one element that's being emitted, it's radioactive forever, even though the actual emission of the particle may render the stuff non-radioactive anymore, whereas for almost any industry, there are thresholds below which is good for consumption or health, and above which you have to have heavier regulation. And that's a whole other kind of worm, but it's also important we discuss that at some point as part of the regulatory package.
Yeah, we don't have time today, but I agree. Okay, one last market opportunity for Kirsty. You mentioned AI, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the two sides, so new energy demand and also opportunities from AI in terms of helping nuclear innovation.
Thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, society's using more and more energy in general. We're hoping to electrify all kinds of things. And then AI comes along. And, there's still big questions about how much, data centers are going to be the major driver for new power demand. Air conditioning, frankly, is going to be it's probably a bigger one in most parts of the world. But we do want equity when it comes to access to these incredible new technologies like AI. So this is a case of actually, being able to respond to, the emerging very large demand from global technology companies in the developed world. And, we're talking about data centers that might be multiple gigawatts in scale. These are big, very big data centers. And they're the most sort of dense infrastructure on the planet. And they need electricity that's ideally clean. And I was going to say reliable, but this is like 99.999. Okay, they call it the 5 nines of reliability. So always on. And then at that multi-gigawatt scale. So it's not that surprising that we've seen the announcements recently from, Meta, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft making, big investments in supporting the development of new nuclear technology because, they recognize that they can't access that scale of new electricity from the existing grid. So they're going to need additionality. That means they need new sources of clean and reliable, dense power that they can contribute into the larger grid and also meet their own, dedicated demand. And they're recognizing that nuclear energy is a really great way of achieving that. So it's a fantastic signal, and it's really helping to normalize, I think, discussions about nuclear in the mainstream sort of discourse. And also in recognition of that, they're not just bringing their demand and their market signal and their resources, they're actually bringing their capability as well. And so we've been partnered with Microsoft. We signed a strategic framework agreement with the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, a few years ago, looking at repowering coal plants for, this reliable energy that we talked about earlier to replace burning coal. But Microsoft, as part of that partnership, has been working with us to develop solutions to some of the big barriers for commercialization of nuclear, and one of the big barriers is licensing, which today represents a very long, very uncertain, very complicated, and very expensive process. And I'm talking like tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars that need to get spent before you know that you've got a project, which for an investor is a really tough ask, right? So one way that we can, compress those schedules, create more certainty, improve the quality of the applications, and massively reduce the time and the cost associated with generating those license applications is to leverage AI. And so Microsoft's been working with us to develop an AI for licensing solution that's now ready, which is very cool, very exciting, and isn't just limited, by the way, to nuclear licensing. It can now be used for environmental permitting more generally. So instead of it taking 5 or 10 times longer to permit a wind turbine than it takes to build one, you might be able to use AI to massively increase that environmental permitting application process. And so now we're just getting started. It's very exciting. The regulators are interested because we also need to not just generate applications with AI, but ideally have the regulators review them as well using AI. And don't worry, humans will still be involved. It's just that humans will be doing the really value-add parts of the process rather than the kind of very manual, repetitive, consistency checking and so on that the robots do super well.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to move. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to move into challenges because it's been very rosy so far. So for Gaëtan, financing, particularly in the EU, there are some restrictions, some constraints, and I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's funny because we talked just before the talk, and apparently it's evolving. But I can tell you, so at Breakthrough Energy Ventures, we have a dedicated European vehicle. So we have a family of funds that can invest worldwide in the billions of dollars of assets under management, and we have a dedicated European fund that I'm specifically attached to. And that fund, at its formation 5 years ago, had a side letter from limited partners that specified that we could not invest in nuclear fission or fusion. And so that intrinsically creates a limitation, and that was a demand that was coming from a intergovernment type of organization. Stefano tells me similar organizations now have removed such condition, which is phenomenal and exciting. But to me, that's the issue, is at the same time that for nuclear there is a required increased coordination at the state level, at the local level, between companies, because we're dealing with materials that we have to be thoughtful about, particularly in fission, at least in our estimation again. But when people say fusion generates no radioactive material, it's a gross simplification. It uses the base material that we need for nuclear, power on the military side. So all of that, when you go down to the details of the analysis, requires coordination. At least it's my overall conclusion, and it has to be people who have the willingness to go into the details and base their discussions and decisions based on, the best I can describe it, is a scientific method. So we need more of that. And nuclear can only precipitate, whether it's fusion or fission, those types of thoughtful discussions. But definitely, again, on the fission side, one of our biggest worry as investors that I can represent for the regulators out there is the established regulations, including on how we go about designing nuclear power plants, that are creating extra cost, right? Just to be thought provocative, it's okay not to have double pipe natural gas inside cities that blow up buildings every so often, but it's sure not okay to do the same in a nuclear power plant, when sometimes you need 3 levels of protection mandated because you have radioactive materials and because of that linear no threshold methodology that we're using. And it's handicapping nuclear, in my opinion, way too much. Does that mean we can forego any and all things and just go willy-nilly? Of course not, and that's why we need soulful discussion. But for us investors, especially the ones that are specialized and are able to look at those distinctions and see when regulations are progressing significantly well in the right direction, start making investments, because now that opens up a market, particularly when we look very specifically at the price of that nuclear power resulting from all those regulations. and the time to build, because that goes hand in hand, it's super important, right? So we keep watching it, we keep trying to engage with all the stakeholders, and it needs to progress. It really does, yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I want to build on something you mentioned around security and this connection with weapons, which we could talk about for a long time. But there's been a couple questions that have come through around, security of materials, proliferation, and also public support, particularly our public perception around fast reactors and reprocessing, which historically have more of a connection to nuclear weapons. So for Stefano, I wanted to ask sort of, are you thinking about government or public opposition to reprocessing MOX fuel or fast reactors, or is the kind of conversation move forward to it's just about what the technology can do and you trust in the regulations and inspections and oversight?
Well, we have to think about the fact that what has been developed for reprocessing in the past was possibly blinking an eye to the proliferation. What we want to implement is completely different. We really want to burn the existing material that can be diverted to for this kind of use. So it's and this requires a slightly different approach from the way the material has been reprocessed today. So at the moment, yes, we are receiving the material from the same facilities. We will be receiving that from the same facilities. We, I think, as a private company, don't have to enter into reprocessing. We prefer it is done by the government and the material given by the government to the companies under very strict control. And we accept to be in a very heavily regulated field, and it has to be continued like that. But we are also like the idea to develop a reprocessing technology that avoid completely the problem of proliferation. So we are also active in this a little bit longer view, which requires also other investments. So it's going to be pushed back a little bit from a private point of view, but we are establishing a lot of collaboration with universities to take back that research that has been done a lot. So there are already non-proliferative reprocessing, and we just want to be using that as soon as possible.
Right, okay.
I mean, very quickly, I'll say, I think you'll have more people going into business if you had more stringent proliferation control and less stringent, safety and design control relative to other sources of energy. So I think all of us welcome more, watchdog and more campaigns and more ways to show that we're not handling this in a way that creates proliferation issue. And you'll find that increasing that level of scrutiny will still, if on the other end you improve regulation in areas that there is no ample science to show that you can improve them in that direction for better design, faster construction, you'll find people be all thumbs up from the inside of the industry to move forward with those things, and it'll be less costly for the society. So.
Okay, wonderful. I had a question come through. It was a little different, asking about, and I don't know the answer, so it's a great question for Gaëtan. I don't know if you want to pick winners right now, but just thinking about fusion, I think it's something a lot of people probably are not that familiar with. So what are sort of the timelines for commercialization? This is something, I know it gets asked all the time. So most promising fusion technologies and timelines for commercialization. I know it's a tough one, but...
So we have 4 investments in fusion. We have one using tokamak concept, which is the most published, most peer-reviewed concept. ITER, which is being built by, an international group of scientists worldwide, is, the tokamak concept. We have concept based on laser, and then a concept based on stellarator, which is a kind of a offspring, if you will, with some better advantages and compared to tokamak. So The reason I mentioned those different styles is it comes in a variety of shapes and colors, and depending on the degree of success that they see, you might see an increased ability to go commercial. But some of the scientific challenges that they're confronted with as they go to generate more power than they use, not in the reactor, but from the socket in the wall, right? Which is one of the other criticism, which is inside the inertial confinement area, you can have more power out than in, but then the entire balance of plant itself typically requires a lot of power, and so there is sometimes some marketing announcement that get people really riled up, and they should, right? We should be specific and precise. Back to your question, though. So if you look at, just compare Commonwealth fusion system to be very specific, right? They decided to go, ITER in Europe decided, okay, we're going to use traditional conductors to create the whole environment of the tokamak where you have the plasma, and they decided to go with a different material called high temperature supraconductors. Doing so allows them to have the same amount of power, reducing the amount of space that you need by a factor of 10 to 30. So you can build the same exact rated capacity, but with this much less material of construction, right? So there are technical challenges associated with that, but if they're able to make their demonstration happen in the early 2030s, they may be able to go commercial in the mid-2030s, right? Now you always ask the question, but we have a problem, we have to go net zero by 2050. I will remind everybody that's a human decision. There is nothing in nature that says it's 2050 or not, right? As a matter of fact, the pessimist in me wants to share with you that we're already way past most of the ecosystem barriers, and we're in for a lot of problems doing adaptation now that we failed at mitigation. So we say, well, saying it's too late is not the way to go solve the problem. And so we're hopeful that we can bring fusion faster, but there is completely a realm, if you were to ask all the specialists in fusion, that says it's going to be mid-2040s, 2050, if excitement remains the same, which it may not, and if, for one CFS that doesn't succeed, if they don't, some other take over from what they learn. The one thing I'll say, which is to me fantastic in both the fission and fusion community, is there is a lot of peer-reviewed discussion. The science is not lost, and that to me is fantastic. So it's not as open world as the world of software is, because you can't do that with fusion and fission, of course, but it's as close as you can be when it comes to sharing scientific ideas and scientific knowledge. So it's not because one of our startups is going to fail that the knowledge is going to be gone forever. A lot of those initiatives are going to get picked up, and whatever they learn is going to be used by the community. So that makes us very hopeful that it's going to accelerate fusion.
That's a great framing. Thank you. And we are at time, so I'm going to try to keep us on schedule. Can everyone join me in thanking our wonderful panelists one last time?